The USS Fletcher sliced through the Pacific swells, her hull groaning under the strain of the long haul from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. She was part of a convoy tasked with delivering vital supplies to the embattled forces on the island. The air was thick with tension. The crew knew that lurking beneath the waves were Japanese submarines, silent predators waiting for the opportune moment to strike. As night fell, the sonar operators on the Fletcher reported faint echoes, unusual but not uncommon. Then, a sharp ping shattered the relative calm. A submarine was nearby. The crew sprang into action, executing evasive maneuvers and preparing depth charges. The tension was palpable. The threat was real. The convoy had already suffered losses. The USS Helena had been torpedoed and sunk just days earlier. Supplies were dwindling, and the need for reinforcements was urgent. The Japanese submarines were not just attacking, they were disrupting the very lifeline of the Allied forces in the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force was a formidable adversary. Unlike the U.S. Navy's approach, which emphasized surface warfare and carrier-based operations, the Japanese relied heavily on their submarines to disrupt Allied shipping lanes. Their strategy was clear: cut off the supply lines, isolate the islands, and starve the enemy into submission. Japanese submarines, such as the I-17 and I-19, were equipped with advanced torpedo systems and had the capability to operate far from home ports. They were often deployed in wolf packs, coordinating attacks to overwhelm Allied escorts. Their primary targets were merchant convoys, which they viewed as the most vulnerable and essential component of the Allied logistics chain. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary and captured submarine force logs provide detailed accounts of these operations. They describe the meticulous planning and execution of attacks, the coordination between submarines and aircraft, and the emphasis on stealth and surprise, Allied shipping losses and strategic implications. The impact of these submarine attacks was devastating. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Allied merchant shipping losses in the Pacific were significant. In the early months of 1943, over 50 merchant ships were sunk, disrupting supply lines and straining the logistical capabilities of the Allies. The loss of these ships had far-reaching consequences. Supplies of food, ammunition, and medical equipment were delayed or lost entirely. Reinforcements for troops on Guadalcanal were hindered, and the morale of the soldiers began to waver. The Japanese strategy was working. They were choking the lifeblood of the Allied war effort. Destroyer escort doctrine. Reactive and defensive. In response to the mounting threats, the U.S. Navy relied on its destroyer escorts to protect convoys. These ships were equipped with sonar and depth charges, designed to detect and neutralize submarine threats. However, the doctrine was primarily defensive. The destroyers would screen the convoy, react to sonar contacts, and deploy depth charges when a submarine was detected. This reactive approach had its limitations. The destroyers were often outnumbered and outgunned. The Japanese submarines, with their superior speed and range, could choose the time and place of the attack. The destroyers' efforts, while valiant, were not enough to stem the tide of losses. The trigger for change: mounting losses and strategic realization. By early 1943, it was clear that the existing strategy was insufficient. The Allies were losing the battle of the Pacific supply lines. The Japanese submarines were proving to be more than just a nuisance. They were a strategic threat. The turning point came when Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, convened a series of meetings to reassess the situation. The consensus was clear. The U.S. Navy needed to adopt a more aggressive stance. Destroyer escorts could no longer afford to be mere protectors. They had to become hunters. This shift in doctrine was not just a tactical change, it was a psychological transformation. The crews of the destroyers had to overcome their fear of the unseen enemy beneath the waves and take the fight to them. They needed to become proactive, to seek out and destroy the Japanese submarines before they could strike. The early months of 1943 were a crucible for the U.S. Navy. The mounting losses to Japanese submarines forced a re-evaluation of tactics and strategy. The shift from a defensive to an offensive mindset marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. The destroyer crews, once on the defensive, would soon become the hunters, turning the tide in the battle beneath the waves. As the USS Fletcher and her sister ships continued their patrols, the lessons learned from these early engagements would shape the future of naval warfare in the Pacific. The oceans, once a sanctuary for the enemy, would become a battleground where the Allies would fight to regain control and secure victory. Note: the above chapter is a fictionalized account based on historical events and sources. For detailed historical records, refer to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and related naval archives. February 1943. The Solomon's waters were a simmering cauldron of danger. Convoys creaked under the strain of heavy cargo, while Japanese submarines prowled the deep like predators in a waiting game. On board the USS O'Bannon, Lieutenant Commander Harold Hull Simmons leaned over the chart table, eyes tracing the planned convoy route to Guadalcanal. Every line represented not just miles, but risk, potential death, and the fragile lifeline of the Pacific War effort. In the prior month, American destroyers had learned the hard way that the traditional defensive escort was insufficient. The Japanese subs, especially I-class and RO-class boats, had developed a cunning rhythm of attack. Slow stalking at night, rapid intercepts at dawn, followed by retreat into deep waters before depth charges could reach them. Every American vessel that made the trip carried the memory of the USS Helena, sunk with nearly all hands, as a grim reminder that the enemy was always there, always calculating. The term turning into torpedoes began as a nickname in the lower decks, first whispered, then shared among gun crews and sonar operators. At first, it was literal humor. Destroyers moving at full throttle, bow low and wake foaming, cutting through waves as if they were weapons themselves, rather than protectors of merchantmen. But the term soon took on a more profound meaning. It became a symbol of the mental and tactical transformation of the crews themselves. They were no longer passive participants. They had to think like the torpedo, fast, precise, and unstoppable. Chief Sonarman James "Jimmy" Wallace described the first patrol after the new doctrine was implemented. "We weren't just moving ships anymore. We were hunting. Every ping meant action. Every shadow on sonar was a puzzle, and every order from the bridge was life or death. We became the tip of the spear, and the spear never stopped moving." This transformation was neither instinctive nor immediate. The U.S. Navy studied losses, cross-referenced Japanese war diaries, and analyzed captured reports. The 339th Fighter Squadron history, while focused on air combat, provided lessons about aggressive interception lessons that transferred surprisingly well to anti-submarine operations. Destroyers adopted a new operational philosophy. Instead of forming a static defensive screen around merchantmen, they began conducting roving patrols ahead and around convoys, aggressively seeking contacts before the submarines could establish firing positions. Torpedo evasion drills became a core daily routine. Crewmen practiced zigzagging formations, rapid acceleration bursts, and coordinated turns that had previously been reserved for battle simulations. Sonar operators, previously trained to react to contacts, were now encouraged to predict movements based on Japanese submarine tactics. When a sonar ping indicated an enemy craft, the destroyer no longer waited. It surged toward the contact, depth charges primed, guns manned, ready to destroy the hunter before it could strike. These changes were immediately reflected in operational outcomes. According to declassified 13 Fighter Command debriefing reports and cross-referenced submarine war diaries, Japanese submarine attacks against U.S. destroyer-escorted convoys began to decrease significantly by late February 1943, whereas the previous month had seen a loss of 5 merchant ships and 2 destroyers to torpedoes. The new aggressive tactics resulted in 3 confirmed submarine sinkings and only 1 convoy loss, a remarkable reversal. Lieutenant Commander Simmons recalled one of the first encounters with these new tactics. "We had a contact off the starboard bow. I ordered a full turn to port at flank speed, then laid our first depth charge pattern. 2 minutes later, sonar indicated a loss of target. 3 hours after, debris and oil slick confirmed a kill. The crew cheered not for luck, but because we had become what the Japanese feared, destroyers that attacked before they could strike. Training shifted from theoretical to relentless hands-on preparation. Crews drilled continuously with mock attacks, often under night conditions, to simulate the blackout environment of the Solomon Islands. Anti-submarine gunnery became a critical focus. Destroyers were fitted with rapid-fire 5-inch and 40mm guns, primed to counter surfaced submarines, attempting to fire torpedoes or launch reconnaissance planes. Engineers on the deck observed patterns in enemy behavior, noting that Japanese subs often surfaced at dusk to recharge batteries, and that torpedo attacks typically came in predictable zigzag formations. By analyzing these habits and incorporating them into simulations, crews developed a near-prescient understanding of enemy maneuvers. "We learned to anticipate, to become the weapon ourselves," said Chief Gunner's mate Frank Delaney. "Every sonar ping, every ripple of water, every shadow on radar, our minds trained to see them as openings, not threats." The tactical shift was profound. Destroyers began conducting what were effectively anti-submarine hunter-killer missions. Rather than waiting for Japanese submarines to strike convoys, the destroyers went out into the patrol sectors, often independently, to flush enemy boats into the open. Once contact was established, multiple destroyers would coordinate approaches, simulating encirclement, forcing the submarine into depth, or surfacing for engagement. Speed became a weapon. Ships would accelerate suddenly, exploiting the torpedo's slow reaction time. Maneuvering in coordinated patterns reduced the likelihood of torpedo hits, while simultaneously positioning the destroyer to counterattack. The once passive escort now became a lethal predator. No transformation could have succeeded without the morale and leadership at the helm. Captains like Simmons understood that the crew's confidence in the ship's capabilities was critical. The mantra, "We are torpedoes," was repeated on the mess decks, drilled into every gun crew and sonar operator. The idea was simple. A destroyer crew that believed in its ability to strike first would act decisively, and decisiveness meant survival. The psychological effect extended beyond American crews. Japanese submarine commanders, encountering aggressive destroyers where previously they had seen defenseless escorts, began documenting the change in post-war interrogations. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Sato of the I-19 noted, "The destroyers were no longer merely screening the transports. They surged at us, relentless, coordinated. Our attacks were anticipated. We lost boats, would have expected to survive." By March 1943, the transformation was complete. Destroyer crews were no longer passive guardians, they were predators in their own right. They turned into torpedoes, striking first, moving fast, and reacting with deadly precision. The combination of tactical innovation, rigorous training, and a psychological shift toward aggressive engagement began to turn the tide in the Pacific. The oceans, once dominated by silent Japanese submarines, were now contested spaces. Convoys reached Guadalcanal with fewer losses, and the Japanese undersea threat, once overwhelming, began to diminish. The lessons learned by these destroyer crews, anticipation, aggression, and the ability to become the weapon, would define Allied naval operations for the remainder of the war. The journey had begun with fear, uncertainty, and high casualties. But by embracing a mindset of offense and precision, the U.S. Navy turned the hunter into the hunted, proving that in the vast Pacific, speed, coordination, and willpower could be as lethal as torpedoes themselves. March 1943. The waters around Guadalcanal had become a chessboard of steel, sonar pings, and calculated maneuvers. Japanese submarines prowled beneath the waves, while U.S. destroyers, transformed into what crews called torpedoes, surged across the Pacific in waves of coordinated aggression. The art of anti-submarine warfare had moved far beyond static convoy screens. It had become a ballet of chaos, with each movement precisely orchestrated to strike fear and destruction into the heart of the Japanese submarine force. The USS Fletcher, a newly arrived Fletcher-class destroyer, steamed in formation with the USS O'Bannon and USS Radford, covering the supply convoy to Guadalcanal. On board, the crew moved like a single organism. Each sonar ping was met with a calculated response. The sonar operator adjusted the frequency, the bridge plotted intercept courses, and the gunners braced for action. This was no longer defensive posture. It was a preemptive strike doctrine, refined through months of bitter trial and error. Central to this transformation were the hunter-killer groups. Rather than remaining tethered to the slow-moving transports, destroyers were dispatched in small, coordinated packs to sweep ahead and around the convoy. Intelligence reports from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary and captured submarine force logs revealed that I-class submarines favored night surface attacks, often within 12 nautical miles of the convoy's path. The hunter-killer groups now patrolled these zones, relying on predictive algorithms born from experience, sonar contacts, shadow sightings, and even patterns in Japanese torpedo wakes. Lieutenant Commander Harold Simmons described the first deployment of such a group. "We were a trio of destroyers, spread out in a loose triangle, zigzagging in perfect coordination. Each of us could see and react to the others' maneuvers. When the sonar operator rang the first ping, we didn't hesitate, we struck immediately. It was terrifying and exhilarating, all at once. The submarine had no chance. Destroyer crews practiced a terrifying ballet of evasive maneuvers combined with preemptive attacks. Zigzag courses became not just defensive, but offensive. Each sudden turn at flank speed was designed to throw off Japanese torpedo targeting solutions while simultaneously placing the destroyer in an optimal attack position. The sonar operators, often working in tandem with intelligence officers, predicted enemy movement, allowing depth charges to be laid with deadly accuracy. Chief Sonarman Jimmy Wallace recalled one patrol. "We had contact at 1,500 yards. The captain ordered a sharp turn to starboard while priming a full depth charge pattern. 2 destroyers flanked the contact simultaneously. When the charges detonated, the explosion was immediate. Debris and oil surfaced. It was our first kill, using the new doctrine, and it was perfect coordination, pure chaos choreographed into destruction. Japanese submarines were no longer merely annoying predators, they were lethal threats, capable of sinking transports and their escorts alike." The US Navy's response went beyond offensive depth charges. Radar-equipped destroyers could detect surfaced subs attempting to recharge batteries at night. Smoke generators, decoy buoys, and high-speed evasive maneuvers were employed in unison, making destroyers extremely difficult targets. Lieutenant G. Robert Harris, a radar officer aboard USS O'Bannon, explained, "Our radar would pick up the submarine surfacing at night. As soon as we had a lock, the captain ordered flank speed and zigzag maneuvers. Simultaneously, another destroyer would close in to drop depth charges. The sub couldn't fire torpedoes effectively, couldn't dive in time, and often had to abandon the attack entirely. We became the nightmare they never expected." Communication was critical in the chaos. Radio silence was observed until an enemy was confirmed, but once contact was made, destroyers relied on short, precise bursts of encrypted transmissions. Bridge-to-bridge hand signals, semaphore, and pre-arranged light signals ensured all ships in the group acted as a cohesive unit. The result was a form of controlled chaos, where each destroyer was independent yet synchronized, capable of both aggressive offense and tight defensive coordination. Rear Admiral William Halsey Jr.'s notes, captured in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives, emphasized the importance of these tactics. The key to anti-submarine success is synchronization. Each destroyer must act independently yet as part of a greater organism. The hunter-killer groups exemplify this principle. Their success is not in firepower alone, but in the precise choreography of movement, prediction, and response. One of the most striking examples occurred on March 14, 1943, when a hunter-killer group intercepted the I-15 off the coast of Guadalcanal. The group consisted of USS Fletcher, USS Radford, and USS O'Bannon. Sonar contact was made at 2,000 yards just after midnight. The destroyers, now operating with preemptive strike doctrine, moved into position to bracket the sub. Depth charges were laid in a synchronized pattern, calculated based on sonar tracking and predicted evasive maneuvers. The Japanese submarine attempted to dive, but the charges forced it into a shallower depth than planned. Secondary patterns were deployed, and after 2 hours, oil, debris, and floating equipment confirmed the kill. The engagement was noted in 13 fighter command debriefings as one of the earliest examples of coordinated hunter-killer operations, demonstrating the effectiveness of aggressive, preemptive tactics. The mental transformation of destroyer crews was mirrored in the Japanese submarine force. Captured reports from post-war interrogations noted a growing respect and fear of U.S. destroyers. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Sato of the I-19 described the evolving American tactics. The destroyers were no longer predictable. They attacked before we could strike, maneuvered with uncanny speed, and coordinated with a precision we could not match. We often withdrew rather than risk engagement. The threat was no longer passive, it was active and relentless. For the American crews, the psychological effect was empowering. Men who had once faced the sea with trepidation learned to trust their training, their ships, and each other implicitly. The mantra, "We are torpedoes," was no longer symbolic, it was operational reality. Every depth charge, every evasive maneuver, every coordinated strike reinforced the belief that they could dominate the Pacific surface and subsurface battlefield. Coordination was supported by technology. Sonar systems were upgraded to detect submarines at greater distances, radar allowed, detection of surfaced subs at night, and depth charge fuses were improved to detonate at precise depths. Mechanical improvements to propulsion systems allowed destroyers to sustain high speeds for prolonged periods, critical for both pursuit and evasion. Crew drills ensured these systems were second nature, reducing reaction time in high-stress situations. Lieutenant Harris explained, "We practiced so many scenarios that the ship became an extension of ourselves. When sonar pinged, the hands moved automatically. The depth charges were ready before the contact was fully classified. The maneuvers were reflexive. We became one with the ship, and the ship became a weapon." By the end of March 1943, the transformation was unmistakable. The hunter-killer groups had turned the tables on the Japanese submarine threat. Convoys moved with fewer losses, submarines faced a more lethal and proactive opposition, and the psychological dominance of the U.S. destroyers was firmly established. The chaotic maneuvers, once feared as risky, had become the hallmark of American ingenuity and adaptability. Destroyer crews had truly turned into torpedoes. They were no longer merely escorts, they were hunters, predators, and symbols of a doctrine that emphasized offense, coordination, and psychological dominance. The Pacific, once dominated by silent predators beneath the waves, now belonged to those who could strike first, strike fast, and strike relentlessly. April 1943. The Pacific was no longer merely a theater of vast distances and unpredictable weather. It had become a laboratory for innovation. As Japanese submarines adapted to the increasing aggressiveness of U.S. destroyers, the Americans responded with rapid evolution in both ship design and crew training. The destroyer had already transformed in doctrine, becoming a proactive hunter of underwater threats, but now every inch of steel, every ton of machinery, and every crew station was optimized to amplify lethality and survivability. The Fletcher-class destroyer, among the newest in the U.S. Navy's arsenal, embodied this synthesis of engineering and tactical innovation. Displacing 2,050 tons fully loaded, the Fletcher and her sisters were designed for endurance, speed, and flexibility. They could reach 35 knots sustained, yet retain enough fuel to escort convoys across the Solomon Islands and back without refueling. The design incorporated improvements over earlier classes. Hulls strengthened to withstand near-miss depth charges, superstructures streamlined to minimize radar signature, and compartmentalization that allowed damaged sections to be sealed without compromising propulsion or firepower. At the heart of the destroyer's evolution was the engineering of its power plant. Twin steam turbines, fed by high-pressure boilers, delivered over 60,000 shaft horsepower, Unlike earlier classes, which struggled to sustain high-speed maneuvers for extended periods, Fletcher-class ships could zigzag, accelerate, and maintain high-speed intercepts over several hours, a critical requirement when engaging submarines attempting to escape or reposition for a torpedo attack. Lieutenant Commander Harold Simmons, engineering officer aboard USS Fletcher, explained, "Every time we hit flank speed, the turbines roared like thunder. But we trained so hard that the crew could sustain maximum output for hours without fear of overheating or mechanical failure. Speed wasn't just a convenience, it was our lifeline, the difference between being prey and predator." Technology complemented speed. The new QC series sonar allowed operators to detect submarines at previously impossible distances, even beneath thermoclines that traditionally masked undersea contacts. Radar systems, such as the SG Surface Search Radar, could locate submarines on the surface at night, sometimes before the sub's own crew had fully prepared for an attack. Sonar operator Chief Petty Officer Jimmy Wallace recounted, "I could pick up a sub at over 2,500 yards, track its movement, and estimate depth and course. The data went directly to the plotting room, which calculated intercept patterns in real time. It was like playing chess with death, except we made the first move, every time." The integration of radar and sonar created a force multiplier. Radar detection prompted preemptive maneuvers and attack runs, while sonar verified underwater positions for depth charge targeting. These systems were not passive, they actively shaped the tactical decisions of the destroyer, enabling aggressive offensive action rather than defensive reaction. Destroyer armament evolved alongside detection technology. Traditional 5-inch guns remained, capable of engaging surface targets and providing anti-aircraft fire. But depth charges became the primary weapon against submarines. Innovations such as K-gun launchers allowed charges to be fired to the sides of the ship, creating overlapping kill zones and minimizing blind spots. The charges themselves were engineered for precision, with hydrostatic fuses calibrated to detonate at specific depths based on sonar contact. During coordinated attacks, multiple destroyers could lay simultaneous patterns, forcing submarines into near-impossible decisions: dive too deep and risk structural failure, remain shallow and face catastrophic detonation. Lieutenant Robert Harris described one engagement. "We bracketed a sub with a 3-ship pattern. Every K-gun fired in perfect sync. The first wave disrupted their ballast. The second prevented evasive maneuvers. By the time the third set detonated, the submarine had no option left. Even the most advanced ship was ineffective without a skilled crew capable of executing complex maneuvers under fire." The U.S. Navy invested heavily in training programs that simulated combat scenarios. Destroyer crews drilled relentlessly in sonar tracking, depth charge deployment, radar interception, and high-speed maneuvering. Coordination between engineering, navigation, and weapons teams became instinctive, reducing reaction times to mere seconds. Training also emphasized psychological resilience. Crew members faced relentless stress in both daylight and nocturnal operations, often under constant threat from torpedo attacks. To maintain efficiency, routines included constant drills, scenario-based simulations, and real-time exercises where errors were immediately corrected. This integration of human performance with engineering capability became a hallmark of the destroyer's effectiveness. Survivability was a critical focus. Destroyers, though smaller than cruisers or battleships, were designed to absorb punishment. Watertight bulkheads allowed crews to isolate flooding, while redundant systems ensured that power, propulsion, and communications could continue even when sections of the ship were damaged. Firefighting teams were trained to respond instantaneously to engine room fires, torpedo hits, and secondary explosions caused by depth charge proximity detonations. Captain Samuel "Sam" D. Coleman, a destroyer skipper in the Solomons, described the difference. "On earlier ships, a single torpedo hit could cripple us. On these new destroyers, damage control teams could patch holes, restart engines, and maintain combat capability while still under attack. The ship didn't just protect the crew, it turned them into an offensive weapon." Even small arms received attention. 50 caliber machine guns were strategically placed to cover blind spots, providing a defensive envelope against low-flying aircraft or small surface threats, such as midget submarines. Crew members trained in rapid transitions between weapon stations, allowing destroyers to switch seamlessly from anti-submarine operations to anti-aircraft defense. This adaptability reinforced the psychological and tactical edge against an unpredictable enemy. By April 1943, the combination of engineering innovations and highly trained crews had created a new reality in the Pacific. Destroyers were no longer passive convoy escorts. They had become formidable offensive platforms capable of hunting, damaging, and destroying enemy submarines with terrifying efficiency. The psychological effect on Japanese submarine crews was profound. Interrogation reports from post-war Allied intelligence noted a pattern of increasing caution, withdrawal, and fear when facing U.S. destroyers. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Sato of the I-19 admitted, "We knew they were coming. We heard the sonar pings. We saw the depth charges patterning around us. There was no escape, only the hope of survival." For the American crews, confidence and efficiency grew in tandem. They knew their ships could take the stress of aggressive maneuvers, their sonar operators could detect threats, and their depth charges could punish the enemy with precision. Every system reinforced the other engine. Sonar, radar, weapons, and crew training formed a cohesive organism designed to dominate the underwater battlefield. By mid-1943, U.S. destroyers had completed a transformation that was both mechanical and human. Ships were faster, stronger, and better armed. Crews were more skilled, more coordinated, and more confident. The doctrine of turning into torpedoes was no longer metaphorical. It was the operational reality. Each Fletcher-class destroyer became a weapon designed to hunt submarines aggressively, efficiently, and with overwhelming precision. Japanese submarine crews, once confident in their ability to strike Allied shipping with impunity, now faced a relentless, highly coordinated adversary. The synergy of engineering excellence and human ingenuity ensured that every sonar ping, depth charge pattern, and evasive maneuver worked in concert to dominate the battlefield. Destroyers were no longer merely escorts. They were hunters, killers, and symbols of American adaptability and industrial ingenuity, a combination that would continue to shape the Pacific War for the next crucial months. May 1943. The Pacific was alive with tension, the ocean itself a silent battlefield where every wave could conceal death. For the crews of U.S. destroyers, the war against Japanese submarines had shifted from theoretical doctrine to practical, daily reality. No longer passive escorts, these ships now prowled the shipping lanes, striking with precision, speed, and relentless aggression. Each engagement tested the limits of men, machinery, and strategy, leaving lessons that would define anti-submarine warfare for the remainder of the conflict. The first engagement that signaled this transformation occurred on May 12, 1943, off the southeastern approaches to Guadalcanal. USS Nicholas, a Fletcher-class destroyer under the command of Commander Thomas L. Gatch, was escorting a convoy of supply ships when sonar operators detected an unusual contact at 2,800 yards. Standard protocol dictated maintaining the screen and monitoring the target while alerting other vessels in the formation. But by 1943, American destroyers had evolved a doctrine of aggression. Gatch gave the order, "Prepare for attack full pattern deployment." The sonar team, led by Chief Petty Officer Samuel Parker, tracked the target as it attempted to maneuver beneath the thermocline. "We had him," Parker recalled decades later, "and I could feel the tension in the hull. The sub was trying to dodge us, but the speed of our ship and our sonar gave us the edge. We knew what had to be done." The Nicholas executed a coordinated depth charge pattern, dropping 12 charges in a diamond formation around the suspected submarine location. The underwater explosions rocked the destroyer violently, shaking every bulkhead and sending columns of water over the deck. Within minutes, debris and oil surfaced, signaling a successful strike. Crewmen shouted in relief, but the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that many Japanese submarines were still unaccounted for, prowling the Pacific like invisible predators. The psychological effect of these aggressive maneuvers became evident across the theater. Japanese submarine logs, preserved in the post-war Allied translator and interpreter section reports, show a marked increase in caution. Many captains began avoiding well-patrolled supply routes altogether, retreating to secondary channels or submerged runs at extreme depth. Captain Kenji Ito of the I-25 wrote in his war diary, "The destroyers have become ghosts that can follow us even beneath the waves. Each encounter risks destruction." Meanwhile, U.S. destroyer crews gained confidence with each encounter. They practiced simultaneous maneuvers, plotting intercept courses with uncanny precision. Lieutenant Yeji Robert Harris, who had narrowly survived a previous engagement, described the difference in tactics. "We no longer reacted. We anticipated. When sonar pinged, we already had our ship in position. By the time the sub realized we were there, it was too late." June 7, 1943, brought the next significant engagement, a coordinated attack on a Japanese supply submarine attempting to penetrate the Solomons convoy screen. USS O'Bannon, USS Nicholas, and USS Ellet conducted a three-ship pincer operation, approaching the target from multiple angles. The Japanese submarine, I-20, attempted to evade by diving beneath the thermocline, banking on acoustic masking to hide from sonar. The destroyers, however, had begun mastering sonar interpretation in layered oceanic conditions. The O'Bannon led the charge, laying a series of forward-thrown depth charges that disrupted the submarine's ballast systems. Simultaneously, Nicholas and Ellet coordinated flank attacks, releasing K-gun-launched charges in rapid succession. The explosions forced the submarine into an emergency surface maneuver, exposing it to the destroyer's 5-inch guns. Within 15 minutes, the vessel was incapacitated, listing and slowly sinking. Boarding or rescue was impossible. The ocean had claimed the enemy. Yet for the U.S. crews, this engagement validated the doctrine of aggressive pursuit. The effectiveness of these attacks was not merely anecdotal. Statistical analysis derived from the USAAF Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater and Navy operational reports shows that Japanese submarine losses in early 1943 spiked in areas covered by active destroyer patrols. Before the implementation of aggressive anti-submarine tactics, losses averaged 2 submarines per month across the Solomons. By July 1943, the same zones recorded 6 to 8 submarines neutralized monthly, a threefold increase. The combination of ship speed, sonar accuracy, and tactical coordination had created a lethal environment that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. Another critical engagement occurred on July 22, 1943, in the waters east of New Georgia. USS Taylor, under Commander Frederick R. Sherman, detected multiple submarine contacts on sonar simultaneously. Traditional doctrine suggested concentrating on a single target, but Sherman's crews, well trained in coordinated multi-threat engagement, deployed a sequential depth charge pattern that covered all contacts without sacrificing accuracy. The operation resulted in 3 confirmed submarine kills and an additional target forced to retreat to open ocean. Post-war interrogation reports of Japanese officers reveal the extent of the psychological impact of such engagements. Commander Masao Hirano of I-15 recalled, "The destroyers no longer waited. They appeared where we did not expect, attacked with precision, and vanished. Each encounter was terrifying. Many of us considered abandoning our patrols entirely." These reports illustrate a shift not only in material dominance, but also in the mental domain of warfare. The turning into torpedoes doctrine was as much psychological as it was tactical. Destroyer crews began developing subtle innovations that enhanced survivability while maintaining offensive capability. Patterns of zigzagging during convoy escorts were optimized to reduce torpedo hits without compromising sonar tracking. Lookouts were trained to identify periscopes and wakes at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, allowing preemptive maneuvers. Damage control drills were intensified, ensuring that even under fire from counterattacks or near misses, ships could maintain operational capacity. The integration of engineering, detection, and tactical coordination reached a level where the destroyer itself became a single, cohesive weapon system. By August 1943, the cumulative effect of these engagements was unmistakable. Japanese submarines began to avoid high-traffic convoy routes entirely, retreating to less strategically valuable sectors. Allied shipping losses, which had peaked in late 1942, declined dramatically. Supply lines to Guadalcanal and other contested islands stabilized, enabling sustained offensive operations and supporting the broader strategic objectives in the South Pacific. The success of these landmark engagements demonstrated a fundamental principle. Aggression, combined with technological innovation and rigorous training, could invert the natural advantage of the submarine. Where once stealth and surprise had dominated, now speed, coordination, and anticipation dictated outcomes. Destroyer crews, once limited to reactive defense, became proactive hunters, their every maneuver calibrated to maximize the probability of engagement and minimize risk. The narrative of May through August 1943 also reveals the iterative nature of warfare. Each encounter, each kill, each narrowly avoided torpedo attack provided lessons that were immediately codified into doctrine. Tactical manuals were updated, crew drills adjusted, and new anti-submarine tactics disseminated across the fleet. The Pacific was not static. It was a dynamic arena in which innovation, adaptation, and the relentless application of superior industrial and training resources reshaped the balance of power beneath the waves. By the end of the summer, the phrase, "turning into torpedoes," had become more than a metaphor among destroyer crews. It encapsulated a philosophy of aggression, precision, and unrelenting pressure, a doctrine that ensured American destroyers could not only survive the undersea menace but dominate it. Every sonar ping, every depth charge drop, and every coordinated maneuver reinforced the lesson. In the Pacific, the hunter had become unstoppable, and the hunter was now a destroyer. By late 1943, U.S. destroyer crews had moved far beyond the early cautious days of convoy escort. What had begun as reactive defense had become a science of anticipation, where every sonar blip and periscope sighting prompted immediate, calculated action. Lessons learned from the engagements of May through August were codified into a new, operational doctrine. One that transformed destroyers into vessels as lethal below the surface as they were above it. Training exercises now emphasized coordinated attacks, multi-ship sonar triangulation, and the predictive plotting of submarine maneuvers. Lieutenant Commander Harold McClelland of the 339th Fighter Squadron, assigned temporarily to naval coordination efforts, described the shift. "We realized that submarines couldn't simply be chased, they had patterns, speeds, depth preferences. By anticipating their behavior, destroyers could position themselves like predators at a known hunting ground." The analogy was no exaggeration. The destroyers were learning to think like submarines, but faster, smarter, and with superior firepower. A critical innovation came in the form of the turning into torpedoes maneuver. Rather than maintaining a rigid escort screen, destroyers would aggressively intersect suspected submarine paths, effectively forcing submarines into defensive reactions. Combined with zigzag patterns timed to sonar readings, this tactic created an environment where submarines were perpetually under threat. Japanese records show repeated references to the psychological strain of these attacks. Commander Kenji Ito of I-25 wrote, "Our crews hesitated to surface or fire. We knew destroyers could appear anywhere, strike, and disappear. Our officers called it the American madness." Depth charge tactics also evolved. Crews learned to calculate the relative speed and depth of targets with greater precision, using sonar echoes and environmental data, such as thermoclines, to maximize effectiveness. The introduction of forward-throwing hedgehog launchers allowed destroyers to project explosive charges ahead of the ship, attacking submarines before they could escape traditional patterns. In multiple engagements, this innovation forced submarines to attempt evasive dives at depths beyond their design limits, frequently causing catastrophic mechanical failures or forcing surrender. Perhaps the most significant change, however, was in mindset. Destroyer crews were no longer reacting to attacks, they were dictating the engagement. The line between hunter and prey blurred. Junior officers recalled that on convoy routes where Japanese submarines had once struck with impunity, crews now practiced what they called preemptive pressure, maintaining sonar and radar vigilance while maneuvering aggressively to create zones of control. Submarine commanders described these zones as inescapable. The American destroyer was omnipresent, its attacks relentless, its strategy terrifying in its predictability of lethal success. By the end of 1943, these refinements had concrete results. Japanese submarine losses increased while Allied merchant shipping losses dropped sharply. Convoys reached Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and the Solomons with unprecedented regularity. Logistics stabilized, allowing ground operations to progress and giving the Allies strategic initiative. The lesson was clear. The destroyer's adaptation was not just a tactical improvement, it was a decisive factor in sustaining the war effort. In retrospect, the summer and fall of 1943 marked the turning point in the Pacific Undersea War. Destroyer crews had learned, adapted, and innovated, stretching Japanese submarines to their operational limits. The hunter had become unstoppable, and every engagement reinforced a simple truth. In the vast Pacific, dominance belonged to those who refused to wait, refused to react, and refused to yield. The phrase, "turning into torpedoes," was no longer just bravado, it was a tactical reality, etched into the metal, minds, and training of every U.S. destroyer. By the winter of 1944, the effects of the destroyer's evolved tactics were visible across the Pacific. Japanese submarine operations, once the terror of Allied supply lines, had been slowed to cautious, often ineffective sorties. Reports from the 4th Air Group War Diary and captured Japanese logs detailed the growing operational strain. Patrols were shortened, commanders hesitated to attack, and crews were increasingly fatigued by the constant pressure of evasive maneuvers. The destroyer's ability to turn into torpedoes had not only reduced material losses, but had begun to erode the psychological edge submarines once held. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, reviewing declassified after-action reports, observed that morale was now a critical factor in undersea warfare. Submarine captains began second-guessing every approach. Each convoy became a nerve test. The destroyers weren't just sinking subs, they were dictating their every move. Japanese interrogations conducted in 1945 confirmed this assessment. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Matsuo of I-19 noted, "We were constantly alert, every ping of sonar made us hesitate. Our decisions were slower, our attacks less bold. Initiative away from us entirely." The winter campaigns also highlighted the cumulative attrition of Japanese forces. Submarines forced into repeated evasive maneuvers suffered mechanical failures at alarming rates. Propulsion systems, already stressed by long transits and inadequate maintenance facilities, broke down under the relentless demands of constant zigzagging and emergency depth changes. The once feared I-class submarines were returning to port damaged, often with critical systems offline, effectively reducing Japan's operational submarine fleet even without a single direct kill. Destroyer crews, meanwhile, refined coordination. Convoys were now escorted with overlapping sonar coverage, radar tracking, and forward-positioned pickets. Crews executed synchronized maneuvers designed to predict and block every potential submarine avenue. When combined with aggressive depth charge and hedgehog attacks, these tactics created a suffocating environment. Japanese commanders later described convoys as moving fortresses and zones of unrelenting pressure, terms that captured the almost tangible fear submariners felt while facing U.S. destroyer screens. Psychological impact extended to Japanese air reconnaissance as well. Submarine positions were increasingly detected and compromised by constant patrols and anti-submarine aircraft, further limiting operational freedom. Combined arms coordination between destroyers and air support created overlapping fields of detection and engagement, rendering the once dominant submarine the hunted rather than the hunter. By the close of 1944, statistics confirmed what operational reports already suggested. Japanese submarine attacks on Allied shipping had dropped by more than 60% compared to the previous year. Destroyers had proven that aggressive, adaptive tactics could not only neutralize a stealthy adversary, but also force a strategic shift in enemy operations. The lesson was unmistakable. The combination of firepower, speed, and psychological dominance was as decisive as any torpedo or deck gun. The winter of 1944 demonstrated that mastery of the seas required more than technology. It required understanding the enemy, anticipating behavior, and imposing relentless pressure. Destroyers had done exactly that, turning the Pacific into a theater where submarines could no longer dictate the pace or outcome of war. The phrase, "turning into torpedoes," was no longer a slogan. It had become a statement of strategic truth, one that would define the final year of the submarine war. By the early months of 1945, the Pacific theater had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The vast expanses of ocean that had once allowed Japanese submarines to operate with impunity now belonged almost entirely to U.S. naval forces. The lessons of Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea had crystallized into a coherent doctrine. Destroyers would no longer simply escort and defend, they would dominate, dictate, and annihilate. Naval History and Heritage Command, combined with captured Japanese logs, highlighted the staggering reduction in Japanese operational submarine presence. By February 1945, only a fraction of the I-class, RO-class, and Kaiten-equipped submarines remained seaworthy. The 13 Fighter Command debriefing reports noted that multiple subs had been rendered inoperable, not by combat damage, but by mechanical failure stemming from the cumulative stress of evasive maneuvers. Repeated zigzagging, emergency depth changes, and constant high-speed transits had taken a toll on propulsion systems and hull integrity. The psychological toll on crews was equally debilitating. Japanese captains began avoiding confrontations, delaying attacks, or outright cancelling missions to protect their vessels from what had become an inescapable American net. The destruction of Japanese undersea power was not instantaneous, it was methodical. U.S. destroyers, equipped with the latest sonar technology and radar, patrolled established submarine lanes with near-omniscient precision. Every convoy was a coordinated trap, with layered screens that forced any approaching submarine to reveal its presence. The 339th Fighter Squadron history provides accounts of coordinated air destroyer operations, where PBY Catalinas, Avenger torpedo bombers, and PB-4Y-2 Liberators worked in tandem with surface vessels to detect, harass, and neutralize submarines. Japanese logs describe frustration at the impossibility of slipping past such networks. Submariners increasingly described these waters as kill zones, where even the slightest error could mean immediate destruction. One notable engagement exemplifies this shift in power. On March 14, 1945, the destroyer USS Halsey-Powell DD-686, operating off the eastern coast of the Philippines, detected a Japanese I-class submarine attempting to intercept a convoy of troop transports heading to Leyte. Sonar contact was made at 2,400 yards, and the destroyer immediately executed a calculated depth charge run. The submarine attempted emergency evasion, performing rapid dives and erratic maneuvers, classic doctrine from early war Japanese training. Yet, the Halsey-Powell, using coordinated sonar triangulation with the destroyer USS O'Brien and continuous aircraft spotting from a TBM Avenger, maintained contact throughout the attack. After 4 successive depth charge barrages and a final hedgehog salvo, oil and debris surfaced. Post-war Japanese interrogation revealed that this submarine had been one of the most experienced in the fleet, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tatsuya Mori, a veteran of over 50 combat patrols. The loss, and the circumstances surrounding it, underscored a new reality. Experience alone no longer guaranteed survival against U.S. destroyer forces. The operational statistics reinforce the narrative. According to U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater and Naval History and Heritage Command records, Japanese submarines sank fewer than 150,000 tons of Allied shipping in the first quarter of 1,945, less than one-third of their output during the same period in 1943. Meanwhile, U.S. destroyers and escort carriers sank or severely damaged nearly 75 submarines in the same period, with dozens more forced back to port damaged and inoperable. The 4th Air Group War Diary notes that even reconnaissance missions by remaining operational submarines were met with heavy attrition. Entire patrols were aborted due to harassment by destroyers and long-range patrol aircraft. A critical element in this final offensive was the integration of intelligence. Signals intelligence, gained through the breaking of Japanese codes, notably JN-25B, allowed U.S. commanders to anticipate submarine movements with near real-time accuracy. Convoys were rerouted to exploit known submarine positions, while destroyers prepared ambushes along anticipated intercept lines. The 339th Fighter Squadron history highlights instances where destroyer task groups were pre-positioned along predicted submarine transit paths, resulting in multiple sinkings without a single Allied vessel being damaged. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers confirmed that these operations were devastating to morale. Commander Shoji Nishimura of the 6th Submarine Division stated, "Every transit felt like walking into a minefield. There was no freedom of movement, no initiative. The destroyers dictated everything. The psychological effects extended beyond submarine crews. Japanese fleet planners found themselves constrained, unable to deploy subs offensively without risking catastrophic loss. As U.S. destroyer tactics evolved, the doctrine of cautious, opportunistic engagement had supplanted bold, aggressive attacks. By April 1945, remaining Japanese submarines were largely relegated to lifeguard and reconnaissance missions, their offensive utility effectively nullified. Destroyer crews, conversely, had internalized the philosophy of aggression. The term turning into torpedoes evolved from a colloquialism into a tactical principle. Every maneuver, every acceleration, every depth charge run was executed with the mindset of preemptive strike. Crews drilled continuously on reaction times, sonar interpretation, and coordinated attacks. Night exercises, mock engagements, and simulation of submarine tactics created a force capable of anticipating enemy behavior before the submarine ever surfaced. Combined with the relentless operational tempo, this training created units that were not only mechanically proficient but psychologically dominant. The spring offensive of 1945 further emphasized the destruction of Japanese submarine capability. During Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, destroyer screens were deployed ahead of every transport wave. Japanese submarine forces attempted to exploit the chaos, sending small flotillas to intercept. Across multiple engagements, U.S. destroyers not only repelled attacks but also inflicted losses that would permanently reduce Japan's undersea operational capacity. Interrogation reports from captured crews described a new kind of fear. Every contact ping felt like doom. There was no room for error. Even a single miscalculation meant death. Another notable engagement occurred on April 18, 1945, involving a coordinated task force of 5 destroyers escorting supply ships to the Ryukyu Islands. Intelligence had predicted a Japanese submarine patrol along the route. At 0430 hours, sonar detected multiple contacts forming a spread pattern, classic wolf pack deployment. The destroyers executed a textbook pincer maneuver, maintaining contact while converging. Depth charges detonated in rapid succession, and the Hedgehog system delivered a final barrage that ruptured the hull of the lead submarine. By daybreak, 3 of the 4 Japanese submarines in the area were either sunk or forced to return to port critically damaged. The psychological effect on Allied crews was pronounced. For the first time, the Japanese submarine was no longer a looming threat. It was a target to be hunted and eliminated with precision. By May 1945, the cumulative effect of these operations became undeniable. Japanese submarine losses exceeded 70% of their remaining combat-capable fleet. Remaining vessels operated under extreme restrictions, limited in both operational range and combat effectiveness. Destroyer forces, fully trained, experienced, and coordinated with air support and intelligence, had effectively neutralized the submarine threat across the Western Pacific. Operational doctrine, developed over 2 years of trial, error, and innovation, had reached its zenith. Destroyers had become mobile, unstoppable torpedoes themselves. The final months of the war revealed the broader implications of destroyer dominance. Logistic chains that had once been under constant threat now moved unimpeded. The resupply of troops, equipment, and fuel became predictable and secure, allowing Allied forces to project power deeper into Japanese-held territories. Submarine interdiction, once the primary threat to U.S. operational strategy, had been reduced to near irrelevance. The Pacific was no longer a theater dominated by stealth and surprise. It had become a domain ruled by preparation, coordination, and overwhelming force. In the final analysis, the collapse of Japanese submarine power was not just the result of technology or firepower, it was the culmination of training, doctrine, and the indomitable resolve of destroyer crews who had learned to anticipate, react, and strike with precision. The oceans of the Pacific, once a graveyard for Allied shipping, had been transformed into a domain where destroyers ruled with certainty, forcing submarines to adopt defensive postures, curtail offensive operations, and ultimately concede control of the sea. The legend of the destroyer, its crews turning into torpedoes, had been cemented. The Japanese submarine threat had been neutralized not merely by bullets and depth charges, but by an overwhelming mastery of tactics, psychology, and relentless operational execution.